All right, everyone, let's talk about strengthening the wrist in relation to bodyweight training, whether you currently have an issue, have had an issue in the past, or have a major fear of developing a wrist issue. Yeah, that's a real thing. We're gonna be placing a ton of anterior stress on our wrists with movements like the handstand push-up and the planche. Not to mention, if we can improve our grip strength, it's also gonna be able to allow us to generate more force in pulling-based movements. And honestly, there's not a shortage of YouTube videos on how to improve your wrist mobility, but there's really few when it comes to actually strengthening the wrist for calisthenics. And keep in mind, the wrists have really poor blood supply, so if we're not doing things to promote that circulation, as well as strengthening or progressively overloading the connective tissue in the wrist, we can start to develop issues as we're advancing our training. With that said, let's jump in the movements I like to use to strengthen the wrist. And actually, before we get into it, keep in mind, I do require a couple pieces of equipment for the exercises we're gonna cover. I specifically got them from Title Boxing. Really, they cost next to nothing, especially when we compare it to other brands producing the same piece of equipment. And honestly, you can just as easily make it at home. Google it, please. This is not a tutorial on how to make equipment. The first movement we're gonna be doing are the wrist rollers in an extension-based pattern. Depending on how low the weight's gonna hang, you might wanna be standing on an elevated surface just to give yourself some clearance. This isn't gonna take a tremendous amount of weight to get the job done. For the setup, I don't find either of these variations necessarily wrong, but in my experience, the shoulders are probably gonna burn out before the forearms, so for this reason, I like to keep my elbows pinned to my side while I'm doing this movement. We're biasing extension here with this pattern, as opposed to flexion, simply because the anterior muscles of our forearms are getting a lot of extra work in with movements like weighted chin-ups and curls. Up next, we have weighted pronation and supination. And while this movement is great at strengthening a lot of the distal forearm muscles involved with things such as golfers and tennis elbow, I'm actually including it for the stretch we can get in the forearms at end range in both directions with a slight modification. With standard pronation and supination, we're gonna rotate until we get to parallel. But with this variation, when we hit parallel, we're actually gonna continue a little further in order to facilitate a stretch in the forearm. This is gonna be the same for both pronation and supination. You're gonna wanna start light with this because remember, doing too much of anything too soon can be problematic. From there, in order to make it more difficult, instead of adding more weight, you can lengthen the lever arm by moving the weight further from your hand. Up next, we have ulnar and radial deviation. The forearm is made up of two bones, the radius and the ulna. So radial deviation is going towards the radius and ulnar deviation is going towards the ulna. And similar to the pronation and supination work, this is a forgotten movement pattern, and especially if we're doing handstand push-up and planche work on parallel bars, extremely critical for wrist health. Outside of that, remember the wrist has poor blood supply, so this is just another way to promote motion that's generally not going to occur. And with all of these movements, you're going to want to keep it somewhere between the 10 to 25 rep range. Lastly, we're going to wrap it up with captain of crusher grip work. The ability to have increased strength in this pattern is really going to transfer to anything and everything from chin-ups and deadlifts to even helping out your back squat. All right, where to start with these? Go ahead and pick 1 to 2 of these movements, perform them twice a week at 3 sets by 10 to 25 reps, and you can rotate them every 4 to 8 weeks. And if you have a current wrist injury, that's when things get a little tricky and you're probably gonna want help or assistance from a coach that understands injuries. So if that's the case, I'll include the info to work with me at the link below. I hope you guys liked the video. Be sure to give me a thumbs up, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos, and I'll do this again next week.